sales rep for a local farming supplies company. And part of his work, he would drive around farms making deliveries and spruiking wares, and often Sher would get to go with him travelling around the farms. Her mother Dorothy was a formidable sort of person and was a strict Methodist, and it's probably fair to say she had very high expectations of both Sher and her brother Alan. The street that Sher grew up in was called Clegg Street, and it was a really pretty dour looking place with rows of joined houses that were built of grey bricks. And at the top of the street there was farmland, and further beyond that there was sort of the relative wildness of the nearby moors. So from an early age, Sher talks about her love of going up and walking on the moors with her dog Fly, and how she loved the wildness of the tops, as she used to call them. And this is perhaps the first inkling of her affection for natural landscapes, which was then to continue throughout her life. In 1939, when Sher was 4, the Second World War broke out, and her dad joined the Air Force, and he was almost immediately sent away, firstly for training and then deployment on active duty, and she didn't see him again for 6 years. So that was, and when the war ended in 1945, and she doesn't really recall the war as particularly having a grave impact on her day-to-day life, but the absence of her dad and the subsequent health struggles that he had after the war were pretty to the forefront, if you like, of her psyche, to a degree. I've just got a quote from, I've been reading her life story, and I've just got a quote here which she says, "Whenever I think of wartime, I remember Clegg Street as it was back then, the snowy winters when we'd sledge down the street and walk to school on stilts of snow built up beneath our clogs. And I remember the summers sparking clogs that when we were running down the pavement. I remember coming home from school to my dog Fly and walking him up the Rakefoot, which was the bit of land above where they lived, along the old road and over the hills to the Cribden Flats." And one other quote which resonated with me was 1945 was the year my dad came home and the lights went on again. So in 1947, when Sher was 12, her brother Alan was born. Sher was called upon to make a significant contribution to looking after her little brother and became almost a de facto second mother to him. I'm sure many of you may have heard Sher tell the story of how she was once sent by her mother to take her brother for a stroll in the pram to buy some things at the local shop. And she walked to the shop and parked the pram outside and went inside to do the shopping. And once she had done the shopping, she then walked back to the house, at which point her mother said, "Where's the baby?" Which she had left Alan parked outside the shop. Sher left school at 14, mainly because of the financial benefit that brought to the family, and she worked in several retail and admin type jobs, and her wages contributed significantly to the Ratcliffe household. She was always a little resentful that she didn't get to do more schooling, but at the same time she was proud of the fact that she had found work and could help to contribute to the family. Teenage Sher was quite a social person by all accounts and had a very wide circle of friends. In her later teens, she would regularly go to dance halls on Friday and Saturday nights, and apparently she was never short of dance partners. Her mother was somewhat disapproving of this sort of behaviour, being a strict Methodist, and Sher recalls many times when she was at odds with her parents over staying out late or meeting up with the wrong sort of boys. In particular, it seems her mother did not approve of her liaising with any Catholic boys. And she recalls that when she was 20 years old and she pointed out her new boyfriend, Peter Story, across a crowded room, the first thing her mother said was, "He looks like a Catholic to me." And what's more, she was right, because her mum was a Catholic. So, Sher didn't let her mother's disapproval weigh on her too heavily though, and she persisted in going out with Peter Story, and in 1960, 5 years later, after they first started going out, they were married. They got married on Christmas Eve in part because they knew that Dad would get leave from the army for his honeymoon, and that would allow them to spend the Christmas holidays together, which was convenient for them at the time, but very inconvenient for everybody else on Christmas Eve. Once Dad had completed national service, they went and lived in London for 3 years, where Sher was employed as secretarial and administration sort of work, and Dad used his background as an electrician to find work in electrical appliance companies. But in 1963, they took the first of their brave decisions when they decided to emigrate to Australia as 10-pound Poms. The voyage by ship to Australia took around 6 weeks, and some of the fellow travellers on that journey became lifelong friends that Sher and Pete are still in touch with up until now. In fact, Sandra Williamson is who her parents came out with Mum and Dad, or is in the room today. Initially, they arrived in Perth, where they lived and worked for about 18 months before they decided to cross the Nullarbor to look for better work opportunities in Melbourne. And that was another significant moment in both of their lives. In the process of driving across the Nullarbor, they fell completely in love with the Australian bush and the Australian landscape. And another quote from her story, her life story. Pete and I fell in love with Australia on that 5 or 6 day drive. More sky, more land, more sea, more dust, more space than we'd ever imagined possible. Rich red painted deserts, a flat forever land, sea cliffs on our right, rock escarpments on our left that seemed to ride alongside us for hours and hours, sunsets that lit the trunks of salmon gums and fired the whole landscape red and gold as far as the eye could see. This journey opened up possibilities for us way beyond the dreams I dreamed as a girl back in Haslingden. This land seemed truly limitless and free. Coated thickly with its red dirt, we felt we'd become part of it ourselves. And it was easy to be filled with confidence and optimism about our futures, our futures would likewise be limitless and free. Well, once they arrived in Melbourne, they did in fact find good work opportunities, and they began to really establish themselves in their adopted country. About 9 months later, in 1965, as if to further emphasise that this was now where they belonged, a certain David Story, subsequently to be known as our Dave, enters the picture. This is quickly followed by the Story family purchasing a brick veneer house in the suburb of Dandenong, which is very anachronistic to what the mum that I know. And living a classic suburban lifestyle for the next 3 years. And in 1968, however, they took another brave decision where they just decided to quit the jobs that they both had and head off travelling around Australia. While there are many stories nowadays of people doing the lap, as it's called, it was pretty rare back then, and their friends and colleagues couldn't believe their recklessness. But we went anyway that year, and travelling led to even further deepening of their love for the Australian landscape and the Australian bush. Any of you who have spent any time with Sher and Peter are sure to have been regaled with stories of the trip, as they used to call it. Interestingly, once they arrived back in Melbourne a year later, Dad actually went back to work at the same company that he left earlier, but with a better job and higher salary. So that certainly it certainly paid off. The next decision they made was, which I would consider brave at the time, was to purchase a bush block at a place called Officer, which was 50 kilometres east of Melbourne. And the decision meant that they had to commute an hour to and from work every day, but they got to live among the trees and the 10 acres of bush. For the next 8 years, Sher worked in secretarial administration work for several companies, and Pete worked as a buyer and purchasing manager for Vulcan Appliances. Their jobs gradually became more and more well paid, but that came with more and more responsibility and pressure, and they began to notice a detrimental effect on their physical and mental well-being. So in 1978, they decided to take perhaps one of their most brave decisions when they decided to quit the rat race, as Sher would call it, and move to Tasmania with the intention to pursue a self-sufficient lifestyle. As a result of some lucky or perhaps astute real estate purchases combined with fairly substantial incomes over the preceding 8 years, they had quite a bit of wealth to their names, and they were able to both buy a property to live on in Tassie and be able to invest a substantial amount of money to provide them with a modest income. So they had it made. On arrival in Tassie, Sher and Pete were completely smitten by the stunning beauty of this place. If they had any reservations about the decision to move south, they were quickly dispelled. They purchased a small acreage in Triabunna, on which there was a sandstone house built in the 1850s, which is in this picture over here, which was painted by Helen G. And they turned their time and energy that they previously devoted to the rat race to being as self-sufficient as possible, and also getting involved in the Tasmanian environment movement. They joined the fledgling Wilderness Society, which at the time only had about 6 members on the east coast. And the burgeoning environmental battle at the time was the campaign to stop the downing of the Franklin River. Sher and Pete set up a small caravan on the Tribunna Wharf where tourists embarked to go to Maroa Island, and over the course of the next 4 to 5 years they recruited hundreds, perhaps thousands of people to support the campaign. They also spent countless hours working on the campaign, including a statewide door knock to promote the campaign for the No Dams vote referendum. Eventually, in 1983, the campaign celebrated success, as we all know, with the Hawke government's decision being upheld in the High Court. The ramifications of that decision and the success of the campaign were momentous. The declaration of the Franklin Gordon Wild Rivers National Park was to follow, and then the declaration of the World Heritage Area, and in subsequent years Sher and Pete were also involved in the campaign to establish the Douglas Apsley National Park, and later were the primary driving forces behind the establishment of the Tasman National Park. But I'm leaping ahead a little. In 1981, Sher and Pete sold their house in Tribunna and moved to a 50-acre bush block in the hills above Coonya, just up this way. Sher would recall the next 9 years as some of the best years of her life. They built their own house in a clearing in the forest using timber which they had sourced from their own block, established a thriving garden to grow their own vegetables, and they lived off-grid using a combination of mini hydro system and batteries to run small electrical appliances. They were truly living the good life. But the aspect of their life in Coonya Hills which Sher valued most was the community of other people in the area who were all pursuing a similar lifestyle. And some deep and lasting friendships were made, and a lot of you are in this room today. Sher recalls Hippie Hill, or Hippie Valley as the area was referred to as the locals, as a blissful place to live. And around this time both Sher and Pete also enrolled at the University of Tasmania as mature age students, and after 3 years of study graduated with Bachelor of Arts. I have to point out that I was also at uni at the same time. It was quite difficult having your parents at the same university, especially since my dad in particular was a better student than I was, and he was doing some of the subjects that I was doing. So. Eventually, in about 1990, Sher and Pete decided to leave their off-grid forest paradise and build a new house not far away on the coast at Cremedina. This house was connected to the power grid, but they still grew their own veggies and tried to minimise their environmental footprint as much as possible. They weren't really slowing down though. They had 2 grandchildren arrived in the early 90s, and so childminding now occupied some of their time, but they also wrote 2 books detailing bushwalks on the Tasman and Forest Sea peninsulas, and they spent a significant amount of time campaigning for the establishment of the Tasman National Park. They also did volunteer work for parks and wildlife and for bush heritage, and went on numerous kayaking and walking expeditions to all parts of Tasmania and the mainland. In 2004, unfortunately, things took a turn for the worse when my dad Pete was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer, and there followed 2 years of hospital visits and medical procedures to try and stave the cancer off. But eventually Pete died in October 2006, which is 17 years ago this week. If Sher was here now, she would tell you that Pete's death marked the end of her real enjoyment of life. Apart from anything else, I think she no longer felt as brave without him. She sold the Cremedina house and moved to Taroona, which was 5 doors up the road from Kath and I. In the following years, she welcomed 2 more grandchildren, Lara and Emma, and spent significant parts of each year living at Piccaninny Point on the east coast as guests of Klaus and Andy, walking along the beaches and writing stories or poetry. She never really felt happy visiting places she used to go with Pete, because the memories just highlighted the fact that he was no longer there to share it with her. I'm sure Sher would admit to some happy moments in the last 17 years of her life, but I think those years seem so terribly bland compared to the exhilarating life she had lived before Dad's cancer diagnosis. Really, she felt she was just marking time until she would leave this life. About 3 months ago, she confessed to Kath and I that she had been suffering from bleeding from the bowel for over 18 months, but had not mentioned it because she didn't want to fuss and didn't want to be enveloped by the medical system, as as is generally the case in those circumstances. Anyone who knew her well will know she had a generally dim view of hospitals and the medical profession. She was certain that she had bowel cancer, but resolved rather than taking a medical pathway, she would prefer to end her life on her own terms. She initially contemplated flying to Switzerland to take advantage of the assisting dying program there, but an old friend from Coonie Hill days, Christina, thank you, suggested that she should try to take advantage of the newly instituted voluntary assisted dying laws here in Tasmania. It turned out that was excellent advice. Cher's cancer was confirmed with the help of one of the nicest doctors and nicest people I've ever met. I hesitate to name him, so I won't, but fabulous person. And she chose to end her own life on the 7th of September this year. It was a strange feeling for us when she died, because on one hand we were really happy for her that she was able to achieve a death that was relatively free of pain and suffering, and it was something over which she had full control. She was able to say goodbye to her family and to many of her friends, and she could even put the bins out, make sure all her bills were paid, and she even attempted to organise her own funeral. There was a lot to be recommended about the manner of her leaving, but still there's a huge hole in our lives where she used to be. One final word from Cher though, from beyond the grave to all of us here today. You should be happy for me. I lived a wonderful life. I went out on my own terms. And this wake's meant to be a celebration, so let's get this party started. Thank you. If anyone else would like to come up and say something, then by all means do so.
Thanks, Dave. I'm not shy to start off. So I've known Shirley for 45 years, and it started, first of all, I had a couple of hours with her about a week before she died, and was overwhelmed by her stoicism, for her determination and cheeriness, and how happy she was to be going out on her own terms. It was just wonderful. I started talking about the old days and our friends and all the things we've done, but she veered the conversation around to the subject in hand and took control, and I've nothing but admiration for what she's done. So in 1978, my late wife Helen and I were moving from our little farm at Kellervee to a new one, Buckland, and we got contacted by Peter and Shirley to come and help us move, and we didn't know them. They just turned up.